Hello everybody and welcome back to our native Android development starter course. In this video we're going to be talking about loops, which is basically a control structure that you can use to run the same code over and over again based on a certain expression. So let's jump right in here and we're going to start with something called a while loop. So I'm going to create a variable that I'm going to call I and set that equal to 0. So I is a pretty standard naming convention in a lot of coding languages and a lot of programming languages. And whenever you're using an index or a counter variable, then I is typically what we use. And if we're using more than one, sometimes we'll use I and J. So to start here with a while loop, let's say I have a while I is less than or equal to 0, then run this code. So this, you can see, is actually, it looks fairly similar to an if statement. And you have your keyword, which is while in this case, and then you have your expression, and then the block of code that you need to run based on whether that expression is met or not. So here, for example, while I is less than or equal to 0, that's not a good expression because y is equal to 0. So let's set I less than or equal to 10 for our expression. And then while we're running that, let's go ahead and do a log statement in here just so that we can see that we're actually doing something. So in here, we're just going to write the value of I is $I. So now, if I were to run this program, you could see I just get this same line 100 times, actually way more than that, thousands of times. And you could see, if it's just going crazy here. So the reason that this is going crazy here is because I have already made a mistake, and I did it intentionally just to show you. This is something called an infinite loop. Essentially, what we've done is we set an expression based on our I value, and then within the logic of our loop, we never changed or modified that I value, which means this expression is always going to be true, which means we are going to continually run this code essentially into infinity, which will cause your UI to lock up and eventually your app to crash. So if you're doing a while loop, always make sure that within the block of your while loop, you have some logic to modify, essentially to modify the value or the outcome of your expression. So in here, I'm just going to increment I. And now if we run that again, you could see now it's much better. I get the value of I is 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9. Which is every I value that's less than 10. So that's what we want for that. Another thing you can do with loops, if we set our counter or our index back to 0, and then if we have an array of names, so val names equals array of, and let's just put some names in here, Ashish, Thomas, Vinod, and Paul. Okay, so there's our array of names. And in here, if we want to use a while loop to iterate through that list of names, you can do it just as easily as above. You say while I is less than, and then we're going to do names dot size. Then we're going to go ahead and log the names. And to get to the names, because it's an array, what you could do is names, and then within your index operator or your square brackets, just put I, because I is going to be going up. Once we put this incrementer down here, I is going to be going up with every iteration through the loop, which means it'll iterate through from 0 all the way up to 3. So that would be how you use a while loop to go through an array. Now, if we can think of a while loop like an if statement, which is essentially it's like an if statement that keeps running itself until the condition has changed to false. There's one other type of loop here called a do while loop. So this do while loop, you're actually gonna check your expression at the end. So let's say I have do, and then in here we'll just copy the same code. Let's log the value of I again. Do that same code while I is less than or equal to 10. So before that, let's say I set I equal to 50, which is obviously greater than 10. So if this was a while loop, this wouldn't run at all. But let me just show you what happens here with the do while loop. So on the do while loop, you get the value of I is 50 one time, and then it's done. It doesn't run again. If I change that to 5 and then run it, then you get the value is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So what's going on here is essentially a do while loop it works very similar to a while loop, except your expression to evaluate whether or not you should run the code isn't evaluated until after the code is run the first time. So this block of code right here is going to run every single time I run my code, whether or not this condition is met, because we're not checking the condition until after. So the condition on a do while loop is not whether we should run the code at all, it's whether we should repeat the code after we've run it the first time. So that is a pretty important distinction there between the while loop and the do while loop. Okay, let's go ahead and get rid of that do while loop and then get rid of this just so we don't put a bunch of extra entries into our log. So now we're back to just our array that we were looping through earlier. So if I was going through this loop and I accidentally put my my increment statement ahead of the log statement, you'll see that if I run this program, this is actually, you can see it crashed my code, it crashed my app over there. And the reason for that is we get essentially what's called an index out of bounds exception, which is where this I, because I'm doing where I is less than or equal to the name.size. So names.size is going to be 4 because I have 4 names in there. So when my I reaches 3, which is the maximum value, I come in here and increment it to 4, and then I'm trying to access the 4th item. So there is no 4th item here because you start with 0, 1, 2, 3. So the 4th item would be the next item in memory, which is not there because you can't change the size of your array in Kotlin after you create it, which means there is no 4th item, and that's going to blow up our code. It's going to crash our app. We don't want that. So to make this easier, in Kotlin, there's something that if you're ever incrementing through arrays or lists or ranges, I definitely recommend you use a for loop, which is something we've touched on briefly in some of the previous videos. But essentially, we can do this same exact thing with a for loop, and the for loop is going to deal with all of the logic for how big it is and when to increment. It'll do all of that for you. So you could just say for each name in names. So here you have the collection that you're wanting to iterate through, preceded by the variable that you're going to call each element in that collection within this block of code. So from this yellow bracket to this bottom yellow bracket, I can use the name variable to refer to whatever element within this array that we're currently going through, depending on what iteration of the loop we're on. So in here, I can do log.i, and if I just write name, this is going to do the exact same thing as this loop. The difference is I don't need to worry about this I less than or equal to names.size. So the expression to evaluate whether I run the code or not, and then when to increment, I don't need to worry about any of that. The for loop is going to do all of that for you. So you see there's my output from the or from the while loop, and there's my output from the for loop. And this is easier in the code, and I know this is a fairly simple example, but when you're going back and changing things later, it's just much easier to have the loop manage the expression and the incrementing for you. So I definitely recommend using the for loop whenever you can. And you can really do this with anything with a for loop. So let's say I want to go through a range of numbers. I can say for number in 1 dot dot 10, just like we did earlier. Well, technically we did 0 through 9 earlier. So if I say for number in 0 until 9, that'll give us the same thing we had earlier. And then if we say log.I demo number.toString. Actually, I did 0 to up to 10 earlier, so let's just do that again here. And if we run that now, you can see we get 0 all the way through 9, which is the same thing we had earlier, but again, you don't have to worry about when to increment and all of that. The for loop does it for you. So we did an array, we did a range. You can also do a list of things. So if we have, for example, here, val list of years equals list of 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, 1994. Okay, that's enough years. And then after that, if it be for year in list of years, and then we come down here, we print that all again. So you do year.toString. So again, this is going to be the variable name that we're calling each item that we find in the list as we're iterating through it within this block of code right here. So within the loop. So if I were to go ahead and run this code now, you could see again it goes through our entire list, and we don't have to worry about indexes, and we don't have to worry about the size of the list. The for loop is going to deal with all of that for us. So it's much easier. And even like if you have a string, you can go through that with a for loop as well. So if I have like just call it hello, val hello equals hello, my name is Tim. So now I can come down here and I can say for char in, or for char is a character, so for char in hello, then log.I char.toString. So now if I run that, you'll see it actually, not only can it go through my array and my range and my list, but it can actually loop through all of my different characters within a string itself. So this is definitely a very useful loop at times, and this control structure is quite useful, especially if you're iterating through collections of data that you already have. So I definitely recommend you practice and mess around with this and understand this, because this is going to be very important as we go on in this course. And that's really all we have for this video. So hopefully this is helpful for you. Like and subscribe if it is. And we will go ahead and see you all in the next video.